Welcome to Healing Solidarity, the conference about reimagining international development. I'm Mary-Anne Clements, initiator of this conference, writer and consultant, and facilitator of the Replenishment Room. And in this conversation, I'm talking with Jessica Horn, who's currently Director of Programs at the African Women's Development Fund. We talk about what it means to take an embodied approach to our analysis and our practice in international development, how we might build mechanisms to support well-being both in our organisations and within our programmes, and why she's tired of African women being expected to solve everyone's problems. This is a fascinating and vital conversation, and I hope that you'll really enjoy it.
Hi, Jessica. It's great to be talking to you today. And I just wanted to start by asking you just to share with me and with people listening a bit about who you are, where you come from, what you do, whatever feels right to share about that.
Sure. So, I'm Jessica Horn, and I'm a feminist activist and have always been.
Mm-hmm.
And I've engaged that feminist activism primarily around the politics of the body, because my belief is that we're born into our bodies,
mm-hmm.
and in some respects, the bodies are all we have. They're our first place, they're our only home, and they're the place where, for women in particular, all of the structural power dynamics, oppressions, marginalizations, rights get played out. And so I kind of pursued that passion in my university studies, but also in my activism for a lot of my activist life, work around violence against women, around sexual reproductive rights, around LGBT rights also, which remains an ongoing struggle and debate in African context and elsewhere, to be fair, HIV, AIDS and solidarity there, which also then, particularly through the violence against women work, led me to doing some engagement and work in conflict contexts as well. And I've done that, in community-based activism, just being around, activist feminist community, not professionally per se, but as a person in the world who's concerned about change, but also in the context of organizations and NGOs. And I've also worked in philanthropy for many years, so in funding, human rights funding and philanthropy. And I currently work in that kind of context. So I work for the African Women's Development Fund as a director of programs. AWDF is an African women's grant maker that was set up by 3 feminist activists, African women who were really concerned that African women were not part of the decision-making process around money that's being spent to advance development and human rights in Africa. And so the fund was created as a mechanism to change that and kind of transform that balance. And I'm a person in the world. So like I said, I was raised in a very political family. It was the era of African liberation, anti-apartheid struggle. And so, my politics looks like that. I'm concerned that we all have a space to live and breathe in this world, and we all have access to the things that we all have a right to access. And I'm very concerned about marginalization. And so it's led me to be in solidarity with lots of different kinds of struggles. But for me, ultimately, it all comes back to this question of how can we live and thrive in our own bodies in a way that's also just and equitable, north-south, but also amongst us, between us as well.
Great. And I want to ask a little bit about how that awareness of our bodies plays into how you do your work at AWDF.
Yeah. We are embodied beings, and I think it's something that office culture forgets. So, right. Office culture is disembodied. And obviously because it was invented, interestingly, I studied medical anthropology, so there's lots of interesting history. Yes. So, a lot of it comes out of kind of like the history of study and the history of the university, which was actually in monasteries and in monastic practice. And the whole idea in Christian monastic practice is that you have to get rid of the body. You have to eliminate the flesh in order to conceive of the higher spiritual endeavors. And so much of monastic life is about erasing the body. And so that has transferred into how we run our teaching, how we structure education. If you think about it, a lot of colonial education systems that have now been inherited in Africa, they very much underprivilege the body. You get beaten for moving around too much in class, right? You're supposed to just sort of stay very still. And in the way that we also structure the work that we do. So I'm always throwing my hands around. I'm always in support of us, moving a lot. In our office, we actually have a practice every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday called the Get Down Breakdown, where at 3 o'clock, without any question, people just go into one of the offices and dance madly for 5 minutes, and it works really well. But also in terms of really, thinking about questions of body politics in the context of the office as well. Most people have a discomfort with the diversity of body politics. And so it's always a conversation that comes up. And I really think it's important for all of us to do a level of self-reflection and think about our own body histories. Because our own body histories are always quite complex and they're never actually conventional or falling into what society expects of us. And I think when you encourage that kind of self-reflection amongst women in organizations, it also opens up space to be able to talk about issues of sexuality, issues of violence and surviving violence, which is a very common experience for all of us, and to be able to open up to greater solidarity, sisters with disabilities, women living with HIV. These are all body histories. Right. And so it allows us to kind of be a bit more open-minded and compassionate when we're thinking about the diversity of the bodies that we work with.
Right. And it occurs to me that really all discrimination is enacted on bodies, even if it sort of it appears to us to be something very head-driven. In fact, it's enacted on people in their bodies because of their bodies of all different kinds. So
exactly. And as a result of that, people then embody that discrimination and they get sick, they get stressed, So, I mean, for example, if you look at the impact of sexual harassment, I've been lucky for almost all of my professional career. I've actually worked in majority or only women-only spaces. Yeah. So sexual harassment has actually been minimal in the context of my workplace, although in the broader community or development sector, it's obviously quite active. But, other kinds of discriminations play out on the body and people get stressed and people start getting sick. And, it's interesting to me that in the broader African feminist activist community that I work in regionally, so many of the brilliant, incredible African feminist activists who are dying early now are dying of cancers. And we know that cancers are stress related. I mean, obviously there's lots of other factors, genetic, etc. But to be honest with you, stress is a major contributor, and we know that. And there's a real trend now we're seeing in terms of women dying way before their time due to cancers. So I think it is really a political thing when we're thinking about how we work, to advance justice and rights, to really think about our body practice, because it's not sustainable to work in the ways that we do, to suffer the amount of backlash that we do, and to not have mechanisms in the workplace to actually support health in that broader way, to support people's well-being, to support people to be able to address the stress, to be able to address trauma that they encounter by witnessing or supporting people, who are experiencing violations or themselves being attacked because of being outspoken in challenging patriarchal power and other systems of power.
Mm-hmm. And is there a way that at AWDF you're able to address that in your programs as well? Because I know you support women activists, don't you? That's part of what your grant funding does, I think. Is there a way that you're able to find ways to and funding to address that? Because I'm conscious that it's the kind of thing that people often say to me, like, "Oh, it'd be really great to do, to look after ourselves, so there's no time and there's no money and all these are the things."
Absolutely. Right? No, absolutely. So before coming to AWDF, I was part of helping create this initiative called AIR. And it's basically a network of African practitioners who are working around issues of violence, mental health, and HIV. And we zeroed in on this whole issue of needing to reconceptualize trauma and think about ways of approaching emotional well-being and mental health from a transformative feminist perspective, African feminist perspective. What's beautiful about it is that it's a network of practitioners. And so it's not so generic in terms of how it focuses. The practitioners work as counselors, psychologists, medics, some as community activists. And we began by documenting some of their methodologies, because some of the methodologies are incredible and are basically adapted to contexts and adapted to the ways that people actually live. A lot of Western psychology and counseling is very individualized. pathologizing of people's emotional well-being, mental health status, and apolitical. Our contention is that actually a lack of emotional well-being and actually many mental health concerns are created or exacerbated by oppression.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, you actually have to take an activist approach to it. Taking a kind of individualistic clinical approach is not going to necessarily fully help a person who is in a desperate state because they are fleeing conflict. They've ended up in a new country, being, stigmatized by police because the police is xenophobic, homeless, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Survivors of multiple, instances of abuse, etc. But a big part of that was also thinking about, and what about us as practitioners? Because that's the part that people don't think about. And it's only in the clinical disciplines that there is some kind of supervision or process for actually accounting for the fact that you give a service and then you will need support to manage your experience of that service. It's really only, particularly in psychology, that exists to some extent in medicine. For us, as women's rights activists, or in the development sector, it doesn't exist. So we started arguing for a need to have occupational, emotional well-being and mental health support. Because if you are exposed to trauma as a result of your job, it's actually the responsibility of your organization to also help you address that. And so to try and think about creative ways, things that don't have to be super, expensive, etc. Not always relying also on the practitioners who don't exist, because basically there aren't really a massive network of feminist counselors in Africa or whatever, the services aren't there, but ways to just acknowledge that that's an issue. So at AWDF now, we are just about to launch an initiative called Flourish. And it's with support from Novo, the Radical Hope stream of funding. And so the idea is a series of different kinds of interventions that are around encouraging African feminist movements to flourish. And one part of it is this collaboration with AIR. So what we're going to be doing is piloting an African feminist well-being retreat, where we're going to actually be looking at, what are the practices that we can develop and share then with feminist activists in terms of being able to sustain their life, their emotional well-being, their health, in the context of the activism that we do. And taking into account the fact that, again, it's sometimes vicarious trauma. We always think about the trauma of the person directly affected, but what about the trauma of the person helping them? So to think about how do we manage ourselves as people who are bearing witness, who are helping the people who are directly violated? And how do we incorporate that into activists, but also organizational practice so that it becomes a slightly more sustainable community and sustainable way of working. So that's one way. It is quite concrete, and it is lucky, I guess, because it's true that, there's almost not even funding for communications in NGOs, right? Let alone some sort of workplace, occupational, health programming. And I think that that's something that finances, that donors of different kinds need to think seriously about, because if they're really concerned about sustaining a sector, they have to think about sustaining the people in the sector. And I think that there's a sense that well-being is all about massages and sort of things that sound luxurious. Our argument is that no, that's actually not what it's about. It's about meeting people and acknowledging that they've had experiences that have made them feel in certain ways. And so that there's a responsibility to then respond to that. And the response may well not be massage, right? So again, it's luxury. It's our mental health is a part of our beings as well. And so what are ways that, we can think about more core funding for those crucial aspects of, it's basically sustaining human resources, sustaining activist resources. And think about it as donors, so we don't underestimate it or consider it to be frivolous and not part of the work.
Yeah. And I think the argument that you make, which I wholeheartedly would support, is actually that without doing that, you end up with a kind of cohort of people working in these contexts who aren't equipped, or who get burnt out and exhausted, who are all over the place, who aren't able to sort of bring their best selves to their work. So in fact, it seems like fun, if you accept that argument, that actually funding is vital for that kind of work, even though it's not really an add-on, you know?
It's not. And I think even in terms of thinking about like the Western development sector, for example, or if you look at humanitarian, I mean, I've spent some time, as I said, in conflict affected contexts, so around those, humanitarian cowboys or whatever you call them. I mean, if you look at the coping mechanisms, right? I mean, there's a lot of extreme behavior, that people do in their private life. I mean, why? Because people are trying to cope with stress. It's a lot. You arrive in a refugee camp suddenly, even having the responsibility of having to consider what to do with 100,000 people who are destitute, who've just been through this tremendous, trauma. And, not always having the skills and background, etc., being equipped enough to deal with it. And I think masculinity plays a big role there because the guys don't want to admit they don't know how to handle this. And so I think that it's relevant to everybody in our context. I mean, in African context, for women's rights activists, there's always been this sense that we'll just do it. Like, it's our duty to just get on with it. Africans are used to dealing with problems. We've all got like stiff upper lip. We're all kind of like brave and resilient and can survive anything. And so just get on with it, and it's like we'll give you maybe like 10% overhead max. The rest of it has to go to the ground, the argument. And it's just like, no, African women are people. And that means we're also emotionally vulnerable. And that, it's difficult and sometimes even harder to bear witness to violations of your own community because it resonates with you. They're people you recognize. And that there isn't some kind of innate natural ability to manage ill fortune or bad news. There really isn't. I mean, we're human beings too. So also that narrative, a little bit of like African women's resilience, I think is slightly problematic because, again, it does acknowledge our humanity, and doesn't acknowledge the fact that there's a lot to cope with. In context where there's very little infrastructure to do so. So we can't go back to an NHS or, go to a service, even in our institutions, that's established to help deal with this sort of stuff. And so it ends up becoming personalized, localized, and people just have to manage by themselves or through community and forming community and being kind to each other and finding ways to cope. But I think it's something quite serious in terms of donors in particular, but in general, the sector acknowledging that it's a serious professional need. It's an occupational need.
Yeah, absolutely. And it reminds me of the article that I read that you'd written about African women and our expectation that somehow this resilience means that they're always working, they're always carrying 5 babies on their back and all their stuff from market, and like all they need is just a little bit of a lift up, and then somehow we'll have changed their lives and they'll be fine. And I'm exaggerating it slightly, but I think it was really interesting the way that you juxtaposed that with kind of the right to rest and recuperation that is enshrined actually in human rights. And just wanted to ask you to speak a little bit to that article and what you were saying, because I think it's a really valuable observation for people to hear more about.
Yeah, so I was thinking about International Workers' Day and, May Day, which has become a little bit separated, depending on which country you're in, but it's become a little bit separated from its actual like trade union and labor rights history. Right. If you look at what it was about, it was really commemorating the struggle of workers to say we need limits on the amount of time that we spend at work because this is inhumane. And so really, ultimately, it's not about celebrating workers. It's about celebrating the right that workers have to not work. And so I was thinking about that, the right to rest, right? The right to have a weekend, the right to have an 8-hour day so that you can then, come home and do what you need to do at home. Look after yourself. If you have a family, look after your family, your community, engage in other activities apart from wage labor. And so again, it was interesting thinking about it in the context of African women's work, because there's an obsession with thinking about African women in work. And it's partly an obsession that's rooted in this narrative of the idea that men have messed up the continent, men from Africa and men who've colonized us and men who run the world today or whatever, and that somehow women are the magic bullet that's going to save us, right? We've had that with the whole idea of educated girls shall change the nation. I'm like, poor child. You know, she literally is at the very bottom of the social, economic, political pyramid. You're expecting her to change your policy decisions? How? That's not fair. Yeah. And so it's a similar narrative of saying, okay, the people in your community who are women who generally, I mean, statistically speaking, actually have, and political analysis speaking, have the least amount of power. Yeah. You're investing in them the responsibility to increase the GDP of the nation. That's not fair. No. So it also, you know, and then there's tremendous expectation that invest in women, because women are going to turn this whole thing around. And so for me, I thought, okay, you know, a lot of African women, regardless of class background, really don't feel entitled to rest. And I think that the reality, the social expectation also of you have your job bringing an income for the family somehow, you absolutely have an unnegotiable job in reproducing the family, so bearing children for it, caring for the extended family, cooking, cleaning, and all of that. When is the time to rest? So when is a space for women's joy? When is the time for women to just chill out and relax? And it sounds so crazy, right? I mean, I've never heard anybody I've been working in the development and human rights field for 17 years. Mm-hmm. Certainly in any mainstream space, I have never heard anybody speak about, you know, African women's happiness.
No.
And so, you know, for me, I just think it's actually a very political question. How do we factor in and enable African women to rest? Because I think if we do, it means we've sorted out the work issue. And so I mean, I think it's an important debate to have, you know, and it's an important debate to think about again, whose duty is it to change society? Because we're also placing this tremendous burden on ever increasingly younger women to transform the continent, but without due recognition also. So most of African women engage economically in a space that they call informal. Mm-hmm. Well, by calling it informal, it means you don't really count it. It means it's not really included in your official statistic about what's happening in a country. And because of that, then you're not necessarily planning for policy investments, etc., to make sure that that sector is supported. And so
it's unregulated. Sorry. I was thinking also it's unregulated, so there's no safeguards or protections
but
as
at the same time, you're relying on that economy to save you. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the actors in that sector to save you. So I just think that there's this kind of disingenuous engagement with African women's work and with African women's contribution. You know, there's very little discussion about things like maternity policies. A country like Ghana, the maternity leave is 3 months. You know, so I mean, I think just those kinds of discussions are what we need to discuss. Is that fair? It's a country where socially motherhood is next to godliness. I mean, there's such mother normativity. Everybody has to be a mother. It's just such a tremendous pressure on women. A social duty. You can be a mother by direct birthing a child. You could be a mother by adoption. Anything. You have to be a mother. Yeah. So for me, I say, okay, that's fine. But then what do you do about the mothers when they become mothers? Do you provide services and support? Do you have health services to make sure that women are not dying? They're respected and treated with, you know, have a sense of informed consent and choices in terms of their birthing experiences, etc. Do you have policies, you know, for workplaces where the mums then have places where they can keep their kids, creches, you know, proper maternity leave, etc., etc. And that's where it all falls flat. So I just think that it's the same thing about how do we then say, if we're venerating certain constituencies of people, how do we acknowledge, like I said, their right to happiness too, their right to rest, their right to also be able to be, you know, the other end of the spectrum of not just excessive labor, but also the chance to enjoy the fruits of that.
and what it makes me think about in terms of kind of development initiatives, many that I've seen, in particularly in recent years, where it's very much like, maybe small grants for women, or to help them establish businesses and stuff. And what strikes me about that in relation to what you're talking about is it's very much like dealing with one part of their life. Like maybe they do want to make more income. Maybe they would quite like a small investment in whatever it is they're doing. But this whole other gambit of their life is like basically ignored or neglected by those kind of programs generally. It's like, it's just assumed that if you give women money, then that will just help their whole community. You put that whole burden on them that the family will somehow then become prosperous.
I know. And right? What's really interesting to me, it's like when you're part of a community of people, you see things slightly differently. So for me, I also ask the question of why is it that we assume that every African woman wants to be a petty trader?
Yeah.
I mean, we're assuming that there's no African women philosophers.
Yeah.
There's no African women artists. Yeah. There's no African women scientists. Right? Like it's also, there's also the strange thing about pushing women into these very limited, narrow options in terms of the work that they can do. And this idea that everything is just utilitarian. I mean, obviously, if you're in a context of economic marginalization where, the pressure is at the level of I can't feed my family, you would want to make money by any means necessary. Fine. Yeah. However, I also think that there's this kind of poverty of thinking in terms of thinking about what are the options and what's available, for African women in order to really be able to pursue lives they want. So some people are petty traders. Some people just are not traders. I mean, I don't come from a lineage of traders. I come from a lineage of poets and artists and politicians and diplomats, and teachers. And nurses, right? So like that's, I mean, I don't come from a family of traders, so it's just like that, also that assumption that like we will have the same lineage and the same interests in terms of how we engage in the economy is also, again, one of those kind of mythologies, very generalized about what African women should do. And I think it's a little bit about the GDP obsession, because the way, even with the, sort of push towards sustainable development and expanding the development discourse that all happened, in the 80s and 90s and what have you. And now we have all these fancy frameworks that include an analysis of human rights and marginalization and all of that. Development is still ultimately framed by a very economistic, utilitarian economistic way of thinking. And I think that that's also what pushes some of this. Because we're thinking about ultimately the impact is about the impact on GDP. And it's not about the impact necessarily on, to some extent, of course, on health outcomes and what have you, but GDP is like the holy grail. Yeah. And I think that that's what's limiting also some of the thinking and some of the imagination. So, I mean, we'll continue to contest and continue to also make spaces so that we can, for example, in the African Feminist Forum, other spaces is where we celebrate that diversity of skill and thought amongst African women. The fact that, different people are good at different things and different people want to do different things and have made different kinds of contributions. And we try and celebrate and explore that diversity, the subversion, the people who go off and do things that are just completely unusual, rather than, again, trying to kind of limit to this very narrow narrative that I think in the long run ultimately doesn't help us, because it's, again, not meeting the actual desire and needs of the people, which is, I think, what any initiative that's attempting to help people should do.
Yeah. And so before we finish our conversation, I'd like to sort of invite you in a way to speak to, say, people working in mainstream development organisations that are hearing you speaking about this. What things could they do differently in their day-to-day practice when they're looking for things to fund? What things should they do differently that might help them to incorporate your wisdom, basically?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there's a lot of stress and pressure around needing to fulfill the sort of outcomes expected in generic frameworks.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is where a lot of the pressure comes from, because, there's sort of like an idea of basic needs that's still very much there as part of development. So it's like, why would you invest in fun when you have to invest on health, or whatever? It's like that kind of pressure.
Yeah.
And so I think if there's any way to try and leverage slightly more flexible resources or encourage flexibility in the resource providers, that would help. I think a genuine solidarity is about listening really closely to what other people are saying they really want to do and being a little bit more led by them in terms of design of things. We're now in such an NGO'd space that, I mean, everybody in the world can speak that NGO lingo and it all sounds the same. Sometimes you can go to a workshop and you just think, oh my gosh, have you guys all been reading the same like publication by you and whatever? It's just like, literally the discourse is like literally the same words floating around everywhere. Sensitization, this, that, and the other. So I think it's something about trying to get out of people what is really, what are their passions? What do they really feel like is going to make the difference?
Yeah.
Acknowledging diversity is critical. And like I said, trying not to be generic in terms of your analysis of who you think people are. Many people in the development sector are people working in contexts that are not their own.
Yeah.
Right? A good part of the development sector are people working in contexts that are not their own. There's all of this, of course, analysis about white savior complex and all of that. I mean, some of that is really just about, of course, acknowledging the legacy or the history of development in the colonial project and its extension, Marshall Plan, and et cetera, so on and on. But I think it's also just about self-reflexivity because we all have to do it. I come from a particular class and educational background in African context that is different from a lot of the constituency that I engage. I don't have a named disability. I'm not HIV positive. Okay. So I have to think about those identities when I'm engaging people who are, and be more attentive and more thoughtful and self-reflexive and understand, well, what do I have to learn about these realities, which also needs to shape how I do my practice, right? And to consciously, sisters with disabilities in particular have really impacted the way I think about self, because I realize the extent to which, as they argue, all of us are only ever temporarily able-bodied. Anything can happen, health, an accident, whatever, and you could end up with some kind of difference in your ability. But yet, so-called able-bodied people never think about that. So it's been something that I've really been thinking about, and the Sisters with Disabilities have really pushed me to think about, how can I consider being more inclusive? How can I consider, if I'm organizing an event, how can I consider the different needs of people who may be attending and ensure that everybody is able to participate with dignity? So I think those kinds of issues around really self-critique, constant self-critique and self-reflection are vital. I think sometimes when you have quite a strong north-south dynamic or dynamic in terms of privilege, you really need to, again, check your privilege and have a think about, what are your assumptions about what people that you consider to have less privilege than you need? Because it may be that you're assuming, like I said, that they just need basic needs. And it could be that the thing they dream of most is like going and hanging out in some like fantastic music space and just vibing, like honestly, right? We assume that it's like people, you're like desperate and all you need is a job or whatever. It's like, well, maybe people, like I said, we're all human. So we all need certain things in our lives, and that includes rest, it includes fun, it includes intellectual engagement, it includes a sense of meaning, being able to be visible, articulate yourself, to be able to learn, to have opportunities, to have access, to have empowered choices, because the structural environment and the social environment enable that. And lastly, feminist struggle is here to stay. And I just think that, in the broader development community, this women's rights thing is not and will never be a fad, the latest donor priority or what have you. That the contentions that feminism puts forward are valuable, are critical, and really need attention and need to be addressed. And I think, the whole movement around accountability around violence and harassment in the development sector is proving that feminism has teeth too. And so, but also has ethical validity, right? And so that I think that it's like, it's clear that it's overdue, to really engage what feminism is putting forward. And again, there's really vibrant African feminist activism in every country and regionally. And I think it's good to read some of that analysis, to hear some of the people, to engage in and invest in the work. Because it's dynamic, and I think it's contributing something that's really game-changing in terms of where we see Africa going.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jessica. I've really, really enjoyed talking with you. And I hope that people listening will take some of that to heart and think about how it impacts their work. And we'll also share a few links to some of the things you mentioned so that people can investigate them more too.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation too.
You've been listening to me, Mary-Anne Clements, in conversation with Jessica Horn, and this is the Healing Solidarity Conference. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to spend a bit more time with the ideas and suggestions discussed in this talk or any of the others in the conference, don't forget you can make a contribution to support the production of this conference, get access to recordings and ongoing conversations about all of these themes and ideas. Just click the link below this video to find out more.